I'm an old man now, 65 to be exact, and truth be told, I don't know how I've made it this long. Just like anyone else, my life has been an adventure full of highs and lows to say the least. But for the past 30 years, it's been more lows than anything else. I've struggled mentally and physically with things I've experienced, things that I've seen. There's a lot to unpack, but most of my issues stem from one fateful night back in November of 1996. I was 35 years young, living the life I always dreamed of, and that I worked so hard for, until something sinister ripped it all away from me. To this day, I'm still not sure what happened that night. Well, I know what happened, physically, but I don't know what truly caused it. And because of that, I've lost more things than I'm proud to admit. My wife left. My daughter thinks I'm crazy. I've struggled with alcohol, and I've struggled with money. But the thing I've struggled with the most is fear. And I'm not talking about some afraid of the dark fear, or some random paranoia I have about something that could happen. I've seen the other side. I've been there. I've walked among the dead. And I've spent the last 30 years in fear of going back. I'm actually writing this in hopes that it'll somehow help me live the rest of my days in peace. But that's hard to achieve when I truly believe that I've seen where some of us end up. I pray every night, seeking salvation and hoping there's a paradise somewhere for all of us. But I can promise you, what I experienced that night, all those years ago, it was not paradise. If anything, it was the exact opposite. For you to truly understand this story, I need to back up a bit into my past, my early years. Because to see why I did what I did, I need you to know who I am, or at least, who I was. I was raised in South Texas, in a small town outside of Corpus Christi. My dad was a fisherman who spent more time out on the water than he did at home. My mother was always tired, angry, and lived a lot of her life battling alcohol addiction. And me, once I turned 12, I spent a lot of my time outside of the house to stay away from the inevitable fights that always seemed to break out. I had a younger brother, but he passed away at only 3 years old from pneumonia. And truth be told, that's what started my mother's issues, I'm sure. But still, that didn't mean I had to sit around and be her punching bag. So I spent a lot of time outside with friends, or picking up odd jobs that a teenager could qualify for. The day I got my driver's license is the day real freedom flowed through my veins. I played high school football and spent most of my time after school hanging out with friends from the team, having bonfires, chasing girls, partying. You know, regular teenager stuff. But one day, our big happy group lost a friend that was near and dear to us. She was only 16, and she was the younger sister to our star quarterback on the team. She was always with us, tagging along for our adventures, so she was someone I saw a lot of, and she was also someone our group highly protected. But one night, she never returned home from her shift at the local diner, and a missing persons report was filed. There was no evidence of anything. She just vanished, and police, at least for a while, had no leads to work with. Our group even took a week off from school to start our very own search party, checking all the back roads and hangout spots we thought she could have run off to. But sadly, none of us ever found anything, including the police. Months went by, and we held on to hope that maybe one day she would return, but ultimately, she never did. When my senior year rolled around, we were finally graced with a bit of evidence that could only produce speculation on what may have happened. A Border Patrol agent had found some clothing deep into the desert, along a smuggling route the cartels were known to use. Her name tag from the diner was still attached, and the speculation of her disappearance had now been announced as a kidnapping, with suspect number 1 being the cartels to the south. Kidnapping and human trafficking happened less back in those days compared to now, but it wasn't unheard of. So although some people in our town were skeptical, us as a group, believed their findings to be true. We used to spend countless hours out in the desert, off-roading, camping, and just running around being kids. And we've even crossed paths with smugglers and illegal immigrants ourselves. So to say the least, it was a very sad day for us, and even worse for her direct family. This lit a massive fire under my ass and pissed me off beyond belief. I was already working with an Army recruiter to ship out for basic training after I graduated. But now, I was shifting my dream from a career in the Army to a career in Border Patrol, and nothing was going to change my mind after that. Flash forward to 4 years after high school, and I'm starting my transition from leaving the military to joining the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency. I wanted to start right away, but Border Patrol wasn't interested in hiring some kid off the street. They wanted people that were a bit older, with some more life experience. So that was the only reason I joined the Army at this point. My 4 years as an MP went by in a flash, because the only thing on my mind was getting out and chasing down the cartels with my own personal vendetta. Looking back now, I wish I would have slowed down and enjoyed it more. But during the time I was an enlisted soldier, it was the post-Vietnam era, so morale was at an all-time low. Nobody respected the uniform I wore, and life in the barracks was bleak to say the least, and riddled with PTSD. So it made my transition out that much easier. And at the time, I truly believed I was going to make a difference here on our home front. Roughly 12 months after my final day in the Army, I had graduated from the academy, spoke almost fluent Spanish, and was on my way to my first duty station in El Paso, Texas, as a certified Border Patrol agent. I remember being more excited than I'd been in years. I remember feeling grateful for being stationed in my home state, and I remember the determination inside of me to become one of the best to ever do it. As the years went by, I took the most intense and rugged route an agent could take. I put in for any extra training or certifications I could that would get me more time out in the desert, chasing down the bad guys. I had no interest in being a paper pusher or working the port of entry. At this time, my heart was still scarred by the loss of my friend, so anything and everything I could to chase down the smugglers and the coyotes is what I did. This choice of path ultimately moved me around more than I'd hoped for. After 3 years in El Paso, I went to Lordsburg, New Mexico, where I furthered my certifications and became part of the off-road program, and next, the horseback program. In the desert to the south of Lordsburg is where I arguably had some of the most white-knuckle encounters of my career. We're getting into the mid and late 80s now, and new cartels were surfacing all over Mexico, causing not only our workload to increase, but making it more dangerous than it ever was before. The cartels were constantly fighting each other, battling over smuggling routes and territory, and a lot of these would spill over the border and onto U.S. soil. They were heavily armed and moved with the tactical intelligence of a special ops team. They aren't just people trudging through the desert. Everything they did was calculated, and everything they did was an attempt to fool us. I earned a lot of respect during my time in Lordsburg and put a lot of hard miles on my body. But I wouldn't trade any of those experiences, because during that time, I was doing exactly what I signed up for. But after a while, it proved to be a lot to handle. My stint in Lordsburg came to a halt in 1989, after a blown-out knee from a foot pursuit. I tore my ACL and my MCL pretty good, and ended up working behind the desk, processing paperwork for nearly a year. I was going stir-crazy, and was actively begging my supervisors to get me back in the field, no matter what it took. And in the spring of 1991, I finally got my wish, and it came with a few perks to sweeten the deal. I'd been with Border Patrol for 10 years at this point, so my reputation and my experience helped shape the deal that they offered me. I was heading back into the field, and I was going to be an operating supervisor. But the catch was, I had to move to Arizona to accept the role, specifically the Douglas sector. I took the offer without hesitation, packed my bags in my U-Haul truck, and arrived in southeast Arizona 2 weeks later. I was a little nervous leaving an area I was familiar with, and I was also nervous to show up as a new leadership, not knowing anything about the sector I was transferred to. But like anything else, give yourself some time, and you'll adjust to the new ways before you know it. My first year as an FOP was challenging to say the least. It came with a steep learning curve. Learning the new area was more difficult than I had imagined, given the nature of the terrain. Although it was only a few hours' drive from Lordsburg, the smuggling routes that were there developed in a different way. The cartels over there worked hard to make their process more hidden, intricate, and detailed. At this time, large amounts of marijuana and cocaine were flowing across the border, and in this part of Arizona, there's a highway system that leads straight to Tucson and Phoenix, where the majority of it gets split up and dispersed out. The Animas Valley south of Lordsburg focused more on human trafficking, whereas my new location had a little bit of everything coming through. There were tall mountains with thick forest for them to backpack, low-lying washes and waterways to avoid detection, and not to mention the tunnels they began digging underneath the border itself. I've seen high-horsepower off-road buggies, loaded down with drugs. I've dealt with bait cars that run and evade to cause a distraction, so the real smuggle vehicles can slip through. And I've even seen shootouts in broad daylight in the border towns along the line. It was a busy area compared to where I came from, but it was a challenge that I longed for since I was a kid. Flash forward to 5 years later, and I've since become a married man and welcomed my beautiful daughter into the world. I was doing great in my position as a supervisor, making good money as a GS-14, and living the life that I always dreamed of. My wife was a local to the area, an area that I was falling in love with. The weather was great year-round, with a mild 4 seasons. We'd get some snow in the winter, and summer temperatures weren't nearly as hot as Tucson or Phoenix. We bought a house in the nearby town of Sierra Vista, and we're actively putting our blood, sweat, and tears into the property to make it our forever home. I plan to work the rest of my years here. I'd even stick around for retirement afterwards. I felt like I did it. I felt like I won the game of life. I was happier than I'd ever been before. But as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end, and mine started down that path on the night of November 24th, 1996. It was the Sunday before Thanksgiving, and a lot of the agents under me were either starting their time off for the holiday or were about to. I remember leaving my house that evening for a night shift, knowing I was going to be short-handed on a patrol route. As a supervisor, I'd spent my days in the truck, just like everyone else, but I didn't have an assigned location like everyone else. My job was to bounce around, help out where I was needed, and be the experienced eyes and ears for anything that could happen. But for this night in particular, we were short-handed, so I needed to sit on an X and work a more legitimate patrol shift. My more experienced guys were the ones already on vacation, and I needed to pick up the slack around the San Pedro River on what was going to be a cold and stormy night. We usually get our first mountain snow during this time of year, and this year proved to be no different. Heavy clouds were blowing in from the west as I pulled out of my driveway that night, and as a team, we were all hoping for a slow and quiet Sunday, given the conditions. Most of the time, during storms and bad weather, things slow down on the desert side of things. Backcountry smugglers are human too, and would need to take shelter from the incoming storms to keep themselves and their products safe. Although through my years, I've seen some ambitious people, most of the time, the rivers, the mountains, and the open landscape see no movement in storms like these. But on the contrary, the activity on the highways seemed to pick up. Our checkpoints along the state roads close when bad weather comes in, so the cartels see it as an opportunity to move everything they can during the storms. And it's sad to say, but most of the time, if you make it out of our county, you're most likely home free. Once you get north on Interstate 10 towards Tucson, it's much easier to blend in with traffic and sneak through undetected. I called out on my radio to my team, moving a few guys around to different locations than usual. I wanted their focus on the two main highways that led to I-10 and let them know I'd be close by, keeping an eye on the river, just in case. After grabbing my gas station coffee, the rain began to fall, and the clouds moved in low and heavy, creating a thin layer of fog that's pretty unusual for the area. And the closer I got to the river, the thicker it became, and the temperatures dropped even further. I pulled into my first spot for the evening, a parking lot by a bridge, where a few hiking trails begin to run north and south. These trails were common with smugglers running along the river. They provided thick cover from the tall cottonwood trees, and great spots to be picked up by vehicles along the way. And just as I suspected, the night was slow rolling. The rain got heavier as the minutes went by, and the radio silence filled the air. I was sipping coffee, munching on some almonds, and not much else. But around 11 p.m., the rain began to slow down before coming to a complete stop. I saw this as my opportunity to step out, stretch my legs, peek down at the river, and use the porta-pot before heading back to my next spot for the night. At this time, there was no sign of anyone or anything. Even the road nearby only showed a passing car once every 10 to 15 minutes. So I was proud of my local community for staying in and staying safe on what could be a dangerous night. After finishing my bathroom break, I hopped on the radio to check in with my guys and make sure their night was just as slow as mine. And again, just as I suspected, everything was the same for them. Minimal traffic, nothing to write home about. In the sky above, I could see the next wave of clouds rolling in from the west, getting ready to cover up the glow of the moon. So I started back towards my truck and planned to head to my next location along the river. But as soon as my hand touched the door handle, I heard a scream that sounded like it came from the north. It sounded like a woman in pain. So I reached in my truck and turned off the idling motor to better hear my surroundings. Within seconds, the screams came through again, and just as I thought, they came from the north, echoing through the riverbed below. I radioed in what I heard, while trying my best to listen closely and determine my path to go get her. She sounded somewhat close, maybe a few hundred yards downstream, so I knew this was a walk-in situation. I grabbed my raincoat from my back seat, my headlamp, and my emergency medical pack, and started my way towards the trailhead. I radioed in a few more times to try and notify my team that I needed backup and possibly medical. But to my surprise, no response ever came through. Everything seemed to be working just fine. I was just getting through to my team a few minutes ago, but for some reason, my calls went unanswered. I stood at the entrance to the trail, looking down towards the river, contemplating what to do. She was still screaming off in the distance, and they seemed to become more desperate each and every time. Our training tells us to never take off into a situation like this without backup, but for some stupid reason, I ignored everything I was taught in that moment and took off down the trail on foot, completely alone. I was following the sound of her screams that oddly seemed to come from different directions the further down the trail that I got. I looked to the sky and saw the clouds getting closer, lower, and heavier than they were before. Everything in my brain told me to stop, to go back, and make sure that I had backup. But my instinct kept my feet moving forward, frantically trying to locate the woman in distress. I could feel the wind picking up the longer I was searching. The air was getting colder, and the light raindrops began to fall on my poncho. I couldn't make sense of it, but it seemed like I wasn't making any ground on her. I'd run 100 feet, and her screams seemed to get further and further away. I gave it my all, bursting into a full-blown sprint in a desperate attempt to close some ground. But after 10 seconds or so, her screams stopped altogether. I kept jogging, moving north along the trail, now fearing the worst-case scenario for the woman in need, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move as fast as lightning between two trees. I turned my head to the right to glance at what this could have been. And the moment I did, I tripped on a rock and face planted into the ground hard. For a moment, everything went black. All my senses were completely gone. I remember opening my eyes, tasting blood in my mouth, feeling a chipped tooth with my tongue. I was laying on my stomach in the dirt, and all I could see was the dark tree line running along the river. My vision was blurry. In my head, it hurt like hell. I could feel something warm running down my face, and after wiping it with my hand, I noticed the fall had scraped me up pretty good as well. I pushed myself up to my hands and knees, staring at the ground, watching the blood drip from my mouth onto the trail. I could see the raindrops hitting the ground around me. I could see the tall grass swaying in the wind from the storm, but I couldn't feel or hear any of it. The only way I can describe it was like being stuck in the vacuum of space. Things were happening around me, but everything was dead silent. I panicked and did my best to get up to my feet. But when I did, I noticed the pain coming from my foot, shooting up my leg and into my chest. The moment I was upright, I had to make my way back down towards the bank next to the trail and sit back down. I became short of breath immediately. My back was in tremendous pain, and in this moment, everything inside of me told me I wasn't getting out of this alive. I tried to radio for help, but it didn't seem to work at all at this point. And after looking at the sky, seeing the clouds descending on my location, I knew I was in serious trouble. I gave one more attempt at getting up to my feet, only to be met by the same excruciating pain in my chest that sent me back down to my knees. I laid there defeated, gasping for air, feeling the weight of the world resting on my chest, before rolling down the embankment a bit, using it to prop me upright. I could see the water flowing by. I could see the raindrops splashing in the river. I thought of my family, my colleagues, and how I let them down, in such an embarrassing way. And everything in me told me I was dying from a heart attack, and I couldn't believe the circumstances that brought it on. After a few seconds, I could hear slow, dragging footsteps coming up the trail behind me. I didn't bother to look. I didn't seem to care. I'd already accepted my fate. I let my head fall back limp and hit the dirt behind me. Everything went black again. Everything faded out. And for a brief moment, I felt an overwhelming feeling of relief and let myself drift off with it. I woke yet again, not sure how long after, still laying on the riverbank. But this time, all of my pain was gone. I brought my hand up to my face, and the blood seemed to disappear. My tooth seemed intact, and my chest felt light. I wiggled my toes and rolled my ankles around. I bent my knees, and everything seemed to work great. I remember the sound of the footsteps behind me and jumped to my feet, completely healthy, like nothing had ever happened. I scanned my surroundings, only for them to terrify me instantly. Everything was dark, and darker than it should have been. The clouds lingered deep in the valley, and everything felt cold, stale, and just overall wrong. The more I looked around, the more everything felt off. The landscape looked the same, just somehow twisted and warped, like I was standing in another dimension. Everything seemed semi-transparent, and my body felt lighter than it ever did before. I stepped away from the river's edge and back onto the trail I came in on, only to be greeted by the sound of footsteps yet again. They sounded like they were getting closer and closer, but I couldn't tell from where. I spun around a few times, trying to locate the sound, but it echoed in a way that didn't make sense. I looked to the south, back down the trail, in the direction that I'd come from, and noticed the silhouette of what appeared to be a woman standing in the distance. I called out to her, asking if she needed help, asking if she was the one that I heard screaming before. But she just stood there, stone cold, didn't move a muscle, didn't respond to anything. I began walking towards her, trying to get a better look, but the moment I did, she turned slowly to her right and walked into the trees beside the river. I didn't know what to think or what to do, so I reached for my flashlight, only to realize it wasn't there. I went for my radio next, and that seemed to be gone as well. I looked down at my body, and although I was still wearing my uniform, none of my gear was on me. My gun, my radio, everything was missing, and I was barefoot. No socks, no shoes. I stood there frozen for a few seconds, trying to decide what to make of this situation, trying to decide what I should do next. I did my best not to panic, but I had no clue what to make of this now. Did someone take everything while I was knocked out? How did I heal so fast? And as far as I could tell, it was the same night, the same storm, the same scenario I walked into. But nothing that was happening around me made any sense. I decided to keep inching my way down the trail towards the woman who walked into the trees, and everything in me told me it was a bad idea. But at this point, I was the one who needed help, or answers, or anything that could help me get out of this nightmare. I approached the part of the trail where I saw her step off and gently moved my way into the towering trees, on the lookout for any sign of anyone. But after just a few steps, I could sense movement happening behind me, so I turned around quickly, only to see the woman standing back on the trail, right where I first saw her. I froze in my tracks, unable to move, unable to speak. I wanted to ask who she was, but I couldn't get any words to come out. She just stood there, wearing ripped up clothing, staring down the trail into the dark and foggy night. After a few seconds, she turned her head, very slowly, in my direction, and stared right through me like I wasn't even there. I could see her face. It was dirty and bloody, like she had taken a serious beating, one that I wasn't sure someone could survive. Still unable to move, the deepest and darkest feeling of fear overcame my body. I began to realize that I somehow knew this girl, and she somehow knew me. It took me a few seconds to process, but I recognized in that moment that this was my friend from high school, the girl who went missing, the girl who was kidnapped. She didn't speak, not physically, but a flood of emotions rushed into my body that explained everything to me very clearly. I was out of my body. I was walking in a dark realm, somewhere between life and death, and she'd arrived to meet me, to let me know that it wasn't my time. I could feel her pain. I could feel her fear. I could feel her soul was lost, forever wandering this dark abyss. I wanted to help her, but she reassured me that I couldn't, and she warned me. She told me to run, because there's souls and other things that linger here that could harm me and trap me forever. She warned me to hurry back before I became stuck, but the problem was I didn't know where to go. She looked away from me and back down the trail to the north, raised her hands slowly, and warned me something was coming. Something already knew that I was there. I looked in the direction she pointed, and all I saw was two glowing red eyes attached to a dark silhouette heading our direction down the trail. When I looked back at her, she was gone entirely. She just vanished into thin air. I panicked and bolted down the trail, running as fast as I could back towards the parking lot where I'd left my truck. I honestly had no idea if that would be my safe haven, but I had no other choice. I had to run to something familiar. I turned my head behind me, looking back to see if this thing was closing in on me. And it was. It was floating above the ground. It had no mass to it. It was just a dark shadow, chasing me into the night. I cried out in prayer, asking the Lord to help me escape this terrifying hell, as I ran for my life. I could feel it getting closer and closer, as I did my best to traverse the rocky and rugged terrain. And just before I got to the hill, past the bridge where my truck was parked, I tripped yet again, stumbling onto the ground, unable to catch myself. I did my best to get back up to my feet as quickly as possible, but when I turned my head to see where this thing was, I assumed it was just too late. It was merely 10 feet away from me, coming at me faster than I could process. I clenched up tightly, bracing for impact, or for whatever pain might follow this horrific situation. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, everything turned bright white, like I'd entered the land of nothing. Everything was silent. Everything was still. There was no pain, no emotion, just complete and total emptiness. I remained in this state for what seemed like a few minutes before I felt a shockwave pulse through my body. It hurt tremendously, and I remember thinking, what in the world was that? But then it happened again, and it hurt even more the second time, sending electricity through every inch of my body. I remember trying to fight off the pain, and I remember watching everything transition from bleach white back to real life. I woke up in the back of an ambulance, confused, scared, and extremely exhausted. I remember the paramedics being completely elated that they had restored life to my body, and I remember feeling the same way as them. I tried to sit up, but they urged me to stay down, stay calm, and focus on my breathing. They told me I'd suffered a heart attack, and I was en route to the local emergency room. This all came as a shock to me, literally, but I remember being so tired that I just closed my eyes and thanked the Lord for bringing me back from that terrible place. I spent a few nights in the hospital as they watched me closely. They told me I had flatlined before they arrived on scene, and I was lucky to be alive. They said they found me in the parking lot next to my truck, that my fellow agents called it in when I didn't respond on my radio. None of this made sense to me. I could have sworn I ran down the river trail, but apparently none of that happened, at least not in the real world. My recovery was slow, painstakingly slow. So slow, in fact, that I earned myself a medical separation from Border Patrol that ultimately ended my career. I became depressed, living life as less than half a man that I once was. But the worst part of the whole thing was I never forgot where I walked that night. I never forgot who I saw, or what I encountered, or what tried to come for me. The dark realm that I stepped into haunted my dreams for years to come, and it still does, a little bit to this day. It affected me so much mentally that I shut down from life completely. My marriage began to fail, and ultimately it did. My daughter left with her mother, and to this day, she rarely speaks to me. I drank myself to sleep more nights than I can count, because it was the only thing that seemed to numb my fear enough to function. I sold everything in Arizona and moved back to Texas, and I damn sure never drove over to that river ever again. I wish I could say I was stronger. I wish this story ended in a better way. But the truth that haunts me is I feel like I got a taste of where some of us can end up, and I'm deeply terrified to go back. I've tried therapy, I've tried hypnosis, and I've even tried church. But nothing seems to help. I can escape the fear temporarily, but something always happens that ends up bringing me back to that night and making me check out from life. I wrote this in hopes that I could make a difference, but I'm assuming, just like everything else, it won't. But what I cling to is my faith. Even though it gets lost sometimes, I still have it. And I'm betting on it, and hoping that when the day comes where it's my time, I won't go back there, but to somewhere bright and beautiful, just like the scripture says. But anyway, thank you for listening, and I hope each and every one of you cherish life the best you can and live it to the fullest. Because I know a thing or two about death, and I dread the day that I have to go back.